of 2007, the idea came to me to create a documentary film based on Sonoma State University's media research program, Project Censored. My next step was to meet someone with a connection to the class.
I told Chris that I was a former Project Censored student and I was published in the 1997 book. I was immediately inspired by Chris's idea to expose why corporate media fails to report the truth.
Our goal was to answer the question:
what will it take to end the reign of corporate media's junk food news?
Does the corporate media fail to report the real, true stories because of vested interests? Or do the American people prefer the sensationalistic junk food news, you know?
That's where, I think we've realized that, we needed to do an analysis of corporate mainstream media.
We need no more proof of the destructiveness of corporate media.
Deliberate decisions are made to withhold information from the people.
American journalism has lost its spine, and we need a spine transplant.
The New York Times.
Contra Costa Times, Vallejo Times Herald, and the San Francisco Chronicle.
I go out through CNN.
Like CNN, ABC, Fox News.
I don't really follow the news very much. Any news I get's from The Onion.
Jon Stewart and the Colbert Report.
Daily Show with Jon Stewart, by the way.
I generally listen to Fox News and some CNN.
I'll talk to friends and family.
Jim Lehrer.
Yeah. Sometimes I hear stuff and I'll just start Google searching for it.
I mostly get my news online.
Online.
Internet news forums.
From WikiLeaks.
I think I tune in less to things like CNN or Fox News because they've definitely moved more into the entertainment side of the business versus the true news side of the business.
Yeah, junk food news, it appears to be like news the way Pringles appear to be food, right? It's, you can snap these back and an hour later you're still hungry, but you have a stomachache too, right? And junk food news is, I think, the journalistic equivalent.
Norman Lear Foundation at USC did a survey recently, and it looked at the 11 o'clock news for months. Hours and hours and hours of the 11 o'clock news. They concluded that of all that time, over all those months, that the viewer was getting an average of 24 seconds out of that half hour. Just 24 seconds of community-based reporting or government. The rest was kicks, guts, and orgasms.
Corporate news right now, it gives you nuggets. It gives you little sensational items. And, all of a sudden you have a scandal about Iraq. But it's just one little view into it.
I have 600 channels in my house. But 400 of them are selling the Bowflex machine. And the rest are jewelry and Jesus. This is not diversity.
The magician is doing this. The trick is happening down here. It's diversion of attention. So all the media spectacle, the game shows, the soap operas, the commercials, the buy this car, blah, blah, all that, it's diversion
Corporate media react to Conan O'Brien's plan to officiate a same-sex wedding on late-night television.
Talk show host Conan O'Brien may be about to push the envelope on late-night television.
Conan O'Brien may be able to push the envelope on late-night television.
Push the envelope. To push the envelope
On his late-night
television.
Conan O'Brien may be about to push the envelope on late-night television.
With so many important issues facing the people of the world today, why does corporate media waste valuable airtime with irrelevant junk food news stories that come directly from entertainment sources?
We've got to, God bless our media. We've got to get an envelope.
On this same day that corporate media bombarded the American public with the Conan O'Brien story, alternative news sources like Democracy Now! Reported the following news story.
Street movement. You know, veterans are coming home and finding that we don't have access to proper medical care, we don't have access to jobs, we're having a difficult time getting the educational benefits that we were promised and that we served for. So, you know, I'm worried about how I'm going to feed my daughter and how I'm going to put her through college.
Let's set aside for just a moment, if you will, that much of what passes for news these days is not news.
This is our big problem, is that stuff that fills us up and gets us fat and stupid, but uninformed.
I'm so struck by the Tiger Woods incident. We criticized him because he had a sexual addiction, which, you know, really, his sexual addiction is not going to impact my 3-year-old grandson when he's my age. Nobody's ever going to remember.
A little upset to see all this hoopla over that reporter who had that brain problem during the Golden Mics.
Well, a very, very heavy rotation tonight. We had a very Darrison bite. Let's go to Terracing those for the bit.
To make her then the object of the story is wasting my time.
The story of Serene Branson has captivated the nation over the last week. The reporter for our Los Angeles station, KCBS TV, was covering the Grammy Awards.
How is that going to make my life better? How is that going to improve things in my community? What does that say for broadcast journalism? And as it turned out, we knew right away that nothing was seriously wrong. It was on the Today Show, and it was on CBS this morning, and we kept talking to them. I talked to the mother, and I mean, on and on and on, of taking this valuable resource of time that we have and turning it into something less important.
Junk food news, of course, Carl started the category when he was challenged by news professionals who said, look, you know, it's not censorship. We just don't have enough time to cover all the important news that happens.
So I said, I think I'll take a hard look at what they're using to fill their time and space. Well, just about the same time, Clara Pella became famous overnight for saying, "Where's the beef?"
Hello? Where's the beef?
So I checked into it, and I discovered that, indeed, they have a limited amount of time and space. And what are they filling it with? They're filling it with what I called junk food news. Where's the beef?
If you live abroad, the December 2011 issue of Time magazine featured an in-depth look at the revolution in the Middle East. In America, we got Why Anxiety is Good for You.
News abuse was a category that Peter Phillips introduced to address, in some ways, a more subtle form of news bias. Stories that have some actual legitimate newsworthy quality, unlike their junk food counterparts, but where the way that the story is presented is so spun or so distorted that the ultimate point of the story gets lost. And this, too, is a form of propaganda. I think both junk food news and news abuse can be thought of as kind of propaganda.
So when we're rescuing Jessica Lynch, the young, beautiful private who's captured by the evil Iraqi, and then they have the troops come in, the special forces, to save her. They waited 24 hours to even get the special forces there, to get the cameras there to take the picture. So that was an alternative story to the day that we rolled the tank tanks into Baghdad, the day that we shelled the Palestinian hotel, killed 2 journalists there, the day we bombed Al Jazeera and killed a journalist there. But in the front pages of the United States, it's the rescue of Jessica Lynch. So that manipulation of news is deliberate. That's top-down control of news. And they'll fill it with sensationalized stories, tugging at your heart, oh, the poor girl, and in its place, the realities of the tanks rolling, over bodies in the streets of Baghdad is lost.
For the past 35 years, Project Censored has been publishing the top censored stories that have been deliberately and systematically withheld from the American public.
Our role is to uncensor the news and let the public decide what the facts say and suggest. I think that's responsible journalism.
Project Censored is about stimulating social activism via, real news and information that the public needs to become an informed electorate.
Now we're talking about stories that are deliberately being withheld from the American people.
Project Censored, the US media watchdog group, has released its annual report examining the shortcomings of reporting in 2012. Amongst the key topics, the rising police state and the erosion of civil liberties.
If you take a look at the last decade, from the Patriot Act to the Military Commissions Act to the NDAA, this is a direct onslaught on people's First, Fourth, Fifth, Sixth Amendment rights. It slashes the notion of habeas corpus that's been a mainstay in Western jurisprudence since 1215. We've really fallen in the United States back into a McCarthyite sensibility, a COINTELPRO kind of sensibility, where we see enemies everywhere, and we've been cracking down on the very things that should be the bedrocks and foundations of our free society, on free speech, on the rights to petition government, on the rights of assembly.
A couple years ago, student Project Censored interns and I wrote a chapter in the book on media coverage of the Military Commissions Act, which of course suspended habeas corpus. And one of the things we looked at in that study was how the corporate media coverage treated habeas corpus as a matter of legitimate political debate, that you could talk about whether it made sense to suspend in a time of a war on terror this fundamental principle of democracy that dates back to the year 1215. It's a foundation for any modern democratic society.
That's not quarter after noon. That's 1215. We're talking almost 800 years of due process rights that were wiped away in the Military Commissions Act in 2006. And even when the corporate press would cover that topic, they acted as if habeas corpus was debatable. They acted as, well, we're not sure. Is habeas corpus something we have? Is it something everybody should have? Should we all be free? Should we all have due process? And I think when you really start to ask those questions, you're already down the slippery slope, and you're headed for trouble.
Loss of civil liberties by the American people is probably the biggest thing that's happened in this decade. I mean, now we no longer have habeas corpus. Any president can decide that you're an enemy combatant and put you in a military prison without trial, without lawyers, without access to your family, indefinitely, whether you're a citizen of the United States or not. They now have active military battalions on duty under the North American Command, ready to go and be police in any city in the United States. We have built detention centers throughout the country, $350 million that went to Halliburton 2 years ago to expand detention centers. They prepared for martial law. The president can authorize the Treasury to confiscate all of the assets of a person who interferes with progress of the war in Iraq. They can take your bank account, they can take your house, and they can make it against the law for your brother to buy you food, or your lawyer to work pro bono for you. So these laws are in place. Now, they haven't enacted these things, but just the fact that they put these laws in place, that they're preparing, they're building an infrastructure to maintain martial law in this country in results of civil unrest, economic collapse, or whatever.
I do fear our government. I think it's become way too strong and too powerful and too invasive. To think that somebody can walk into my home and arrest me and I don't have the rights to habeas corpus, which the Constitution gives me. They can haul me off if they can prove that there's any reason to suspect that I might be a traitor. And who's to define that? I mean, you know, am I a traitor because I wrote a book that criticizes the government? I don't think so at all. I think I'm a very, very loyal citizen because I think democracy is built on questioning.
The heart of what Project Censored does, which was we're often bringing forward stories that are deeply uncomfortable for the American public. Despite all the rhetoric about supporting the troops and our soldiers or our heroes, we have a situation where the social services they need coming home from having served the country, often social services aren't available to them at the level or in the scope that they require. And the result, more soldiers were committing suicide than were dying in combat.
The #1 story from 2012 was about the numbers of suicides that have been happening in the United States military. And it turns out that there were actually more suicides than there were deaths in wars.
First saved message. Copy. Last year with section leader of Havoc snipers, quite possibly the most intense time of my life. Anyway, but I'm fucking wasted, man. In case you haven't been paying attention, the bulls are fucking tearing it up, man. So I was out drinking a night at the Tubby Bear, watching them. But anyway, man, my bad. I saw you message me a couple days ago and I didn't really feel like the answer I gave was enough. I'd love to talk to you, man. I hope you're doing good. It's been a long time since we caught up. But if you get this tonight, man, I'll probably be awake for maybe another hour or so. And if you don't, give me a call, sometime this week, whenever you get a chance. But love to talk to you, man. If you're, talk about next time you're coming to town, everything. Anyway, want to catch you up. Miss you, brother. And I hope to hear from you soon. Anyway, this is the Z-Man calling Section Leader Koski, and Z-Man out.
This is why Project Censored is so necessary, and this is why an independent press that isn't tied to exclusively to the usual Rolodex of government sources is so crucial.
By connecting citizen journalists all over the world and bringing out these stories that contradict the mainstream lies and challenge these paradigms is one of the most important tools that any journalist or any reader, any truth seeker should have in their toolbox.
Until Project Censored came along, I wasn't aware that anybody else was doing anything like that. Of course, you had, investigative journalists pointing out censorship, pointing out missed stories, but the systematic exposure of censored stories by Project Censored, I think has been an important contribution.
We have to have Project Censored. Whoever came up with the idea of Project Censored is a genius because they allow us to know the things that other people would rather us not know.
Watergate itself was the actual inspiration for Project Censored. Why in the world Richard Nixon could be reelected by a vast majority some 5 months after Watergate, which was the largest political crime of the century. On the night of the election, there was no discussion whatsoever of Watergate. A lot of alternative publications were running regularly information about Watergate and all the rest, but the more I checked into the alternative press, the more stories I discovered that I hadn't heard about, I didn't know about, despite the fact that I like to think that I was on top of the media at the time. And that was the genesis of Project Censored.
Project Censored is the largest media research organization in the country that publishes the top 25 censored stories from the corporate press into a book every year.
Project Censored, the research is done by over 200 faculty and students. Students are actively looking for and researching important news stories and see, was this covered in the corporate media? And if it wasn't, and the class thinks this is an important story that we should investigate more completely, it'll go to a faculty evaluator. So if the story is in political science, it'll go to someone with a PhD in political science. We have over 100 faculty evaluators and community experts, doctors, lawyers. Students will write a summary of that, and it goes into a pool of stories. And then it's a voting process. We double check the stories and make sure they haven't been run since we first checked them. And then we have national judges, people like Michael Parenti, Noam Chomsky has been a national judge with us. Then we vote on them. We pick the top 25.
Students are really amazing. Watching students develop from someone who's taking a class because they need 4 units credit to fulfill a requirement to they're on fire about the suspension of habeas corpus. And they care now passionately about that issue, and they're informed about that issue to the point that they can talk to their friends and their family and people in their community about that. Really, for me, is one of the crucial aspects of Project Censored.
Project Censored has given me what I've wanted, in the sense that I want to be informed. I want to know what's going on because it does affect me. I'm a person who believes it does affect my life.
What if just a big enough majority of people understood the truth? Could we actually make a change? When I think about that, that gives me hope, and I continue to do what I do, talk to people about what's really happening.
I was a kind of student that would just go to class, stay quiet, do the task, and that was it. I never talked to the instructor or anything. And after that, I was trying to get answers. I was realizing that this perfect world that America is, it wasn't perfect, and there were some imperfections that needed to be seen and brought to the public.
We began our college and university affiliate program, and what we did is we branched out from Sonoma State University. What would it look like if we were able to sort of take Project Censored on the road, kind of a thing. In other words, where else could people model this, right? Imagine what could happen if we had the kind of classes that Project Censored is involved in social departments, but they could be in any kind of discipline. So I think the affiliates program is one of the significant changes, is that we broadened the base, so to speak.
I love connecting what we learn in the classroom to what's going on outside, and I think that for me, Project Censored fits perfectly because we're able to look at what's going on in corporate media and see what's being said and what's not being said, and then how we as students and teachers can identify things that aren't being talked about that really need to be out there. And to get your story that you've hunted down up on a website and to just be part of that process is empowering. It's enriching. It's so many different really great things for them. You know, I've always seen social ills as something that are fixable, I guess. For example, corporate media, if we all just let corporate media feed us what it is we're supposed to be learning, then we easily can forget about the stuff that really is harming our society.
Good evening and welcome to CMM, the corporate mainstream media news network. I'm Sold Out. In today's news, U.S. Congress sells out to Wall Street again. Federal lawmakers responsible for overseeing the U.S. economy have received millions of dollars from Wall Street firms.
Cut! That wasn't in the script. And remove that image. Who in the hell added that? Where did you get this information?
Well, I got it from this Project Censored book.
Give me that. Are you serious? Project Censored? What kind of crap is this? Let's try this again, and this time, follow the script.
A bailout for the rich occurred today. Some of the top recipients of contributions from companies receiving Troubled Assets Relief Program TARP money are the same members of Congress who chair committees charged with regulating the financial sector and overseeing the effectiveness of this unprecedented government program.
Cut! What are you doing? I told you to follow the script. You are not following CMM policy. Get out of here. Ms. Burton, take over.
Good evening, and welcome to CMM, the Corporate Mainstream Media News Network. I'm Hallie Burton. In today's news, Americans are breathing a sigh of relief as Congress has agreed to bail out our struggling banking industry, saving our country from a deeper recession and economic collapse. In other news, Lindsay Lohan was implicated for allegedly stealing jewelry, and Charlie Sheen, he's back in rehab.
Implicitly, we have a concentrated, top-down corporate media system that's primarily oriented to make money and provide entertainment, and is increasingly a propaganda machine for the military media industrial complex of the United States.
The stations used to be family-owned. Guess what? They're all gone. They're all owned by multinational corporations.
The country is run by a few big interests looking after themselves and not for the benefit of the population.
Well, the corporate media does it by the book. They do the time-life approach. They go down the middle. They never say anything too controversial. If you try, like, to criticize Westmoreland in Vietnam, you get into a whole scandal like Dan Rather did, and you don't get away with that stuff. So as a result, they barrier everything to death, and it becomes sanitized and boring.
The way it works is, and I've been in these conversations, this is how it works on the inside. You have the responsibility for a newscast. And every morning the scoreboard lights up. Here are the demographics from last night. Here's what you did with Network X. Here's what your competition did. By the way, they handed your head to you last night because we think they concentrated on the story most people wanted to hear. Paris Hilton, murder case on the West Coast. You insisted on leading with something, an international story. And here's what Network Y did. That's the way the pressure works on you.
Censorship is one of our most serious problems, if not the most serious problem. And I think we have to look at censorship as taking many different forms. But there's this much more subtle form of censorship, which is exercised every day by the mainstream press. Mainstream press is a good way to put it, where the owners censor it. I talked recently to a very high-up reporter in one of the major U.S. newspapers, the New York Times, and he said, you know, I'm not censored. I can write anything I want and turn it into my editor, but he decides what to publish and what not to publish. And if he doesn't publish any of my stories for a couple of weeks, I lose my job. So theoretically, I'm not censored. Nobody puts black lines through sentences. It's not the old-fashioned form, but he's censored.
Fear permeates every newsroom in the country. One of the fears is that our circulation will go down, or our ratings will go down, or demographics will go down, and I do not accept myself in this criticism. It is, listen, somebody else is running with a story that I don't think ought to be the lead story. But for 10 days, they've been on a ratings climb and we've been on a ratings decline. And the reason entertainment values have reached the point where they've almost tsunami-like overwhelmed news values is this reality. If you continue to lose demographics, you continue to lose in the ratings, you probably aren't going to last.
The corporations control the world today. There was a time not so long ago, a few hundred years ago, when geopolitics of the world was controlled by religious organizations. And then it was governments. And you had some totalitarian governments, you had some democratic governments, but governments really ran things. Today it's the big corporations.
The antitrust safeguards that had been put there around back in the 30s had been completely dismantled or ignored by the courts. So we need to go back to basics and enforce our own rules. The elites have gotten to a point where they're above the rules, as we are seeing now with the economy. And that's obscured by our media, who are complicit and part of the same clique. And we need to dismantle all of that through reforms
and just say, no, let's go back. The rules actually say this. We need to enforce this.
In 1996, Congress passed the Telecommunications Act, which led to a gold rush of media mergers and takeovers in the United States. Today, fewer than 5 major media corporations dominate U.S. news and information systems.
As a student of Project Censored, we discussed the spin that corporate media used when describing the Telecommunications Act of 1996. It was supposed to create competition among media corporations, ultimately benefiting the American public with increased relevant news.
Welcome back to the Project Censored show. This is Mickey Huff in studio with Peter Phillips. For the last segment of the show today, in the last 5 so odd minutes we'd like to call attention to a couple of guys that have been making a film about media censorship. So that's certainly right up our alley.
The film is an impassioned call to arms and a cautionary expose of the social hazards of junk food news.
Really, it's a smokescreen. In the background, there's a lot of political and social issues that are not being reported.
We can do this, anyone can do something, whether it's write a blog, do a radio show, put a song out there. There's so many ways that you can create change in this world. We need to get this conversation going. We want to bring an awareness to Project Censored. So it's kind of a wake-up call and a call to action. We're 2 fathers from California. We're raising children. We've got full-time jobs. And we've taken the past 6 years of our lives to work on this project. This is our activism.
You've been traveling around the country for the last 5 years now, getting this kind of footage, right? And you're putting together this story of media censorship, propaganda.
The fact that we have censorship in our media is not an occurrence that happens because of ignorance. It is something that happens because of deliberate policy.
What the corporate media do, basically, is they parrot the arguments of the administration. They don't challenge the administration, they report the administration. But in reporting them, they are giving the administration the airwaves. They're giving them the platform. They're crowding out everything else. They're not reporting the views of the opposition. And so all that the public gets is the statements of the political leaders of the country.
I get invited to be on right-wing radio and right-wing TV because they want to have some lefty straw man that they can slap around. So I've been on Hannity and Combs and Greta Van Susteren and those kind of shows. And it's interesting, Hannity and Combs, you see how it works. You're in a remote studio, you got super bright lights in your face, you can't see the camera, you got no monitors, you can't see what they're doing, and you've got a little earpiece in your ear that when it comes time for you to talk, they turn up the volume on the B-roll. It's some demonstration, and Hannity is saying, I want you to denounce these violent protesters. I say, well, I denounce all violence. Yeah, but I want you to denounce these particular protesters. And unless you say what they want you to say, they're not going to let you continue. They're going to keep interrupting you.
We can see this quite clearly in the news coverage after the 9/11 attacks. Has media's criticism of the government become unpatriotic?
Want to know what I was doing? Shut up. In respect for your father, who was a Port Authority worker, a fine American, who got killed unnecessarily by barbarians.
By radical extremists trained by this government.
Respect
not
for
the
him.
people of America,
I'm not
the
gonna
people, the
address you.
ruling class, the small minority.
Cut his mic, cut his mic, cut his mic.
There has to be really clear separation between the media and the government and media and corporations.
The media has a tremendous influence in the development of public policy and in the way in which public policy is implemented.
The American public are the true owners of the American airways in America, not the corporations.
You take away that family pride, community-owned, and you no longer have any kind of compelling reason to tell the real truth and to really go underneath the layers and cover a community like it needs to be covered.
The information that the public gets is very poor. They are not told the truth about what is going on. And so the corporate media, simply play a role in reinforcing whatever deceptions are being carried out by the government.
We came to the conclusion from a lot of the interviews we conducted with these, we would call them critics of corporate mainstream media or former corporate mainstream media anchors, and that really came out of it was you've got this major fear component to news and also this distraction piece. Let's divide the nation against each other. And when you've divided a nation against each other, that's when nations fall victim and prey to war.
If large corporate newspapers and TV stations were to just stop feeding this frenzy of fear and difference.
But they keep us on this sort of on the edge of this cliff. Might happen, might happen. Fear is a big factor in telling news in America today. Fear the rain, fear the traffic, fear the mechanic, fear the mailman, fear this, fear that, to the point where you're so uneasy after watching the news, local news, that you feel, well, I watched local news to find out what's happening in my community. Instead, I'm walking away needing a Xanax, because, all they did is scare me. But it's intentional. The marketers say if you scare them enough, they like that. Scare me, and people will start watching your news.
Sanity. I made a film called Cuckoo's Nest, and I have a section in Cuckoo's Nest, and you'll hear guys saying things in there which are sane. And yet, in the outside world, you could hear somebody on television saying, well, we got a bomb here, or these guys are out to kill us, so we have to kill them first. And they're sane, and that's what intelligent journalism can point out.
The way the mainstream media rationalize this is that, oops, gosh, we were so silly. Gee, really? Geez, had we only known, we would have... No, you knew perfectly what you were doing, but your agenda was different. Perfect case in point is the New York Times, which I blame for helping take us to Iraq. Between them and the New York Post, there was a definite agenda to let the invasion occur, and they did.
The wars get packaged, they get prepared. So you hire Rendon Group, that's a PR firm that likes to do wars. They did Panama, they specialize in, they work for Clinton, they work for Bush.
In Iraq, when the American media like to show the missiles taking off, Al Jazeera says we like to show what happens when they land, which is censored in this country.
We spend more on the military than the rest of the world combined, a budget of $711 billion this year on U.S. military expenditures. We have 725 bases worldwide.
In the United States, the discretionary budget is about 60% military. However, if you look at all the spin-offs, all the military programs that then affect insurance companies and healthcare companies and food vendors and suppliers and the banking industry, all of that feeds into that 60%, it's probably closer to 80%.
We need to talk about the war as a new economy. We need to talk about the fact that many of the major news networks are deeply embedded in this economy. One of the most dramatic examples of this is General Electric, which owns NBC. GE is one of the biggest players in the so-called homeland security sector. Check the logos on the side of all the machines at the airports. The more afraid we are, the more money they make.
GE is a bomb maker. NBC is not going to be against war. Simple as that. It's not even that they generally sympathize with companies that are their advertisers, or that they... No, it's that they are the problem. NBC equals GE equals military industrial complex. End of story.
When I was an economic hitman, officially I worked for a consulting firm called Charles T. Main in Boston. We had about 2,000 employees, consultants, professional people. My official title was chief economist. I was a partner in the firm, and I had several dozen people working for me. That was my official title. But really, tongue-in-cheek, I was an economic hitman, which essentially is a con artist. And we could use all the resources of this company to create economic models and so forth that would prove to countries like Panama, Ecuador, Indonesia, countries with resources our corporations covet,
We economic hitmen have managed to create the world's first truly global empire, and it's basically a secret empire. We do it many ways, but principally, we identify a country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sisters. The money never actually goes to the country. It goes to our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in that country that help a few very wealthy people, but don't benefit the majority of the people who are too poor to buy electricity or have cars to drive on the highways, and yet they're left holding a huge debt that they can't repay. So we go back at some point and say, you know, you can't pay your debts. Give us a pound of flesh. Sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies. Vote with us on the next critical UN vote. Allow us to build a military base in your backyard. Something along these lines. And when we fail, the jackals go in and either overthrow or assassinate these leaders. And if the jackals fail, as they did in Iraq, then we send in the military. I don't think the failure is capitalism. I think it's a specific kind of capitalism that we've developed. We've created what I consider a mutant, viral form of capitalism. And this mutant form of capitalism, which I think is really a predatory form of capitalism, has created an extremely unstable, unsustainable, unjust, and very, very dangerous world. I've met a lot of terrorists. I've interviewed them for books. I've never met one who wanted to be a terrorist. They're desperate people. If we want to get rid of terrorism, we must get rid of the root causes, that cancer that is destroying our whole system. Because I think it's really important that we understand today, we cannot have homeland security unless we understand that the whole planet is our homeland.
For the enemies, we can apply rational standards. For ourselves, not. And this enters into even choice of coverage. So take, say, Africa. There's extensive coverage of Darfur, a lot of protest movements and so on. And it's a major atrocity. There should be. It's not the worst atrocity in Africa, not even close. I mean, Eastern Congo, the number of deaths in roughly the same years is probably 10 times as high. It's a monstrous atrocity. Almost no coverage.
Most people don't recognize the level of death that's occurred in the Congo and the wars there, which is a significant story. Over 5 million people have died in the Congo since the war started there, the civil wars and that, mostly over mineral wealth. And that we all carry with us a piece of the Congo, and that's coltan in our cell phones, which is a mineral that 80% of it comes from the Rift Valley in the Congo. Corporations fight over it. Military fight over it. Lockheed Martin can't go to work. I mean, they can't go to work without it.
In Eastern Congo, the criminals are transnational corporations and states that back them, who are tearing the country to shreds because they want mineral resources.
I mean, we're reaching levels of death almost on par with World War II in Europe. In one small country, the Congo. So that's a massive story that hasn't been widely understood in the United States.
Well, that's just not the right kind of story. So in fact, there's nothing, almost nothing about it.
Who is managing these airways? Who owns them? Are we going to continue to see these corporations size down this industry to where you turn on a channel and it's the only channel there because it's owned by the largest corporation? When Americans have no choice and when there is no diversity of information, then there is no information because they're getting it from one source, and who's to say the source is credible enough and not subject to any kind of corruption?
Reflect on the role, the power, and the importance of the alternative media.
Well, it's I would compare it to oxygen, really.
Without alternative media, we make our decisions on the basis of lies and distortions. And when we hear that the government, through the CIA, has special department who presents language and ideas and descriptions of things which on the basis of that we make our decisions.
It's independent media that really is the mainstream message for which we have to build a culture of acceptance and understanding in American public. Validate those sources and be able to address stories that tell us what's really going on in our lives.
Well, we should have alternative media and a wide variety of them. And what's online can be very useful. What's online is a huge mass of material, probably 90% of which ranges from worthless to harmful. And you have to work and understand to pick out what makes sense.
Thousands upon thousands of small outlets, newspapers, magazines that are plugging away, trying to have their own little influence. That's the only hope. I mean, without KPFA, for example, without Pacifica Radio, there's so much I'd be missing. I would just be more vulnerable to the dumbing down, to the brainwashing.
Radio has become a portal to the internet, and that the real information happens on the internet. We've got, you always hear a radio producer say, we've only got 20 seconds left and we have to explain this, why the United States is still in Pakistan, or the drone question, of course, impossible. But people, if they get that website, they can go behind the radio, they can go to that information, they can research, they can go into the archive. I mean, there are producers that have come to our stations, Amy Goodman would be one, who are now on thousands of stations. And the Pacifica offered that gateway. I think the same actually could apply to a program like Project Censored, that once people hear it, once people get to like it, once people get to know about it, it's not a gateway drug, it's a gateway media, but it's like that. We come in through Pacifica and then maybe go out. But Pacifica is that incubator, it's that gateway. It introduces, it's open to the public. People do not have to have conventional radio skills to be on our radio.
We're talking about the real issues. We're going to the people who are being affected by policies on the ground. We don't talk to spokespeople. We don't talk to talking heads. We talk to people who are reporting from their backyards, talking about what they're seeing, witnessing from their own backgrounds and their own history and their own reference point in that story. And people who are involved in the struggle. And if you look at how CNN or even NPR and the New York Times covers stories, they talk to officials. They talk to people who represent certain groups with vested interests in manipulating a story or capitalizing literally on the story or an issue. We go around the back end and we talk to people who are being affected.
And that's why as much independent media as possible is to be encouraged, because they provide another voice. I mean, think of the voices out there.
What we need is the material you see at Project Censored, Democracy Now!, The Guardian, BBC, Flashpoints.
WikiLeaks' example of showing the failure of journalism, because all that information was available, maybe not in as documented a form, but was available to journalists of the world and kept from the American people, kept from the people of the world. WikiLeaks should be celebrated as a breakthrough.
The WikiLeaks revelations are extremely important, and they take me back to Danny Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers and the revelations that came out of that and how that changed our understanding of the war, etc. And it is surprising to me how little real attention is being paid to that.
I would say that a coup really took place right after 2003, an executive coup that almost suspended the Constitution. And the American public have shown themselves, it's not their finest hour, very frankly. They've not shown themselves either dedicated to maintaining that democracy or using what democracy we have left, and we do have a lot left, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. There aren't enough Americans who use that freedom so far, not only to keep it, but to expose the corruption, the massacres, the absolutely unconstitutional actions that are taken very often, and the reckless endangerment that we're put into. Well, I have to say Americans on the whole have not shown themselves as committed to maintaining a republic as people who fought for that a couple of hundred years ago.
Historians used to talk about having a usable past. And that's an important concept. The progressive historians talked about that a lot, because history is not something that we study just for the sake of studying it in the abstract. We study history because we want to change the future. We want to understand what's happening now. We want to change the future. Project Censored is about the same thing. It's about critiquing the media, critiquing the way history is presented, critiquing the kind of knowledge that people are getting now, because they're not getting the kind of knowledge and information that they need in order to change the world.
Really, I would say as many as 80–90% of people really don't want to know the truth. They really don't, because then they're going to have to do something about it. I think many people, we watch CBS, we watch ABC, we watch the mainstream media, and we know a lot of it's propaganda, but we just go along with it. And it's really hard to listen to community radio sometimes because of the story we tell. It's radical, and it forces us to actually think and maybe do something about it.
Reality is radical. When Union Carbide kills 20,000 people and leaves 200,000 other people crippled and all that in India, in Bhopal, and not a single person has spent a day in jail, that's not, when I report that, that's not my radical ideology.
When corporations are not held accountable for human rights violations, as in the Bhopal tragedy, the yes men impersonate big-time criminals in order to publicly humiliate them and otherwise give journalists excuses to cover important issues.
The BBC was forced to apologize to Dow Chemical today for broadcasting a hoax interview by an anti-corporate protester. The man appeared on BBC World claiming to be a representative of the Dow Chemical Group.
Do you now accept responsibility for what happened?
It's 20 years since the disaster, and today I'm very, very happy to announce that for the first time Dow is accepting full responsibility for the Bhopal catastrophe. We have a $12 billion plan to finally, at long last, fully compensate the victims, including the 120,000 who may need medical care for their entire lives, and to fully and swiftly remediate the Bhopal plant site.
My radical ideology might attune me to that story and to understanding what the implications and abuses are of that story, but my ideology didn't create that story. That's reality. Reality.
The problem is that there are vested interests in keeping you stupid.
The media, the government, control our culture.
The media is more than just part of the problem. It is the problem in this country.
Don't go against the media. Don't never go against the media. They'll eat you up alive.
Go to the front page of Yahoo and their trend factor will let you know what the average American is thinking about, and Britney Spears seems to be in the top 10.
Sandra Bullock is everywhere right now. That's like the buzz or the meme.
So they're going for the spectacular stories, you know, sensationalism.
Sandra Bullock, and then underneath Sandra Bullock is, oh, there was a giant oil explosion today. Oh, on Earth Day, wonderful. But let me go back to Sandra Bullock because that's way more interesting.
That bothers me a lot because I want to know what's going on in the real world. And I'm someone who's actually spent more time living outside the U.S., so I'm kind of aware to what's going on and so forth. And when I'm here, I'm not getting the real deal. I think it's more about who got booted off American Idol and all that garbage, and I don't care about it.
Truth emergency is really the genesis that should be sort of a battle cry to get everybody involved, all citizens involved in understanding that there is this emergency of understanding, meaning, again, that we don't often seem to have a lot of information attached to understanding. So no matter if it's election fraud or immigration issues, the recent bailout phenomena, whether it's issues of 9/11 or torture and the torture memos, again, there's very few people that seem to have a grip on the truth behind a lot of these issues. And again, when we say truth, we're talking about fact-based reporting, and that's something that seems to be lacking from a lot of the corporate press.
I think people are actually going towards these really grassroots, do-it-yourself radio stations and television stations and blogging stations to get the information that you can't get anywhere else. And that's what's exciting. And I'm excited as a radio programmer to also be involved in this kind of restructuring and resurgence of this new media and this digital revolution. And I think we're also going to see these, establishment media structures fail one after the next, after they become more and more irrelevant.
The relevancy of local news or broadcast news will slowly die with the baby boomer generation that created it, then corrupted it.
I think mainstream media is pretty much helpless. The question that we have to answer is an owned media looking out for stockholders ever going to give us news that are going to make their stockholders very uncomfortable?
I think the American people need to understand how much we're left out of the decision-making process, how much we're deceived. I think it's fair to say that the major institutions in the United States today are not supporting democracy. They're doing the opposite, whether it's education, healthcare, business, government, whatever, it's not supporting democracy.
It's time for a truth emergency. It's time to stand up. It's time to demand that the American people be given the real news, the truth.
They want to hold corporate media accountable because when you don't have accountability, you end up in a situation that we're in currently, not only economically, but with perpetual wars. In order for us to take the driver's seat on a more peaceful world, it's got to start with corporate media presenting real truth, news, and information, and not propaganda.
We're not going to stop covering controversial issues just because certain groups are displeased with it. And we have angered people on the left, we've angered people on the right. Maybe we're doing something that's worth doing.
I think we just have to change the playing field a little bit, so that the playing field no longer is maximizing profits regardless of social and environmental costs. The playing field now is make profits, but only while being socially and environmentally responsible.
So I think there's a lot of hope, not only for Project Censored to tell that news to the world, but to tell that news to the working people of the United States, that we have a democracy that we can use and that we can build our own economic structures as well.
You got all of these grassroots efforts that are coming up from the base of society on a different principle. It's not about how can I get rich and make money. It's about how can we save humanity from itself.
Changes in consciousness take place below the surface of action, and so they're hard to measure. But every once in a while they break out, they break through the surface. And only then do you realize that a change in consciousness has taken place.
Yes, there's censorship, but there's still quite a bit of freedom in this country. Let's make sure we don't lose that through a Patriot Act or through this or through that. People so far, knock on wood, have never come to my door and said, "Is this your cartoon? Okay, you're under arrest." Like they do in many countries. That hasn't happened, so that's the good news. I have a wide enough perspective on things that I do treasure that very much. I don't take it for granted. And that's what's allowed me really to function as a political cartoonist. I'm free to say what I want.
I'm an optimist by birth. I think the future looks good. I'm really excited about the internet. I'm really excited about what Peter's doing with the satellite schools participating with the project. I really think that as people are exposed to more and different sources of information, specifically on the internet, they will be saying, yes, we're not getting all the information we need. The mainstream media or the corporate media had damn well better get their act together.
At Project Censored, again, what we're trying to do is uncensor that kind of material, and hopefully we'll continue to do that for years to come until it wouldn't be needed anymore. But frankly, over the last 36 years that Project Censored's been around, I think things are actually, well, they're getting better and worse, but the worst component of it is it's still there, and it's not going away.
It's going to take more than just turning off corporate media. It's going to take action. Media watchdog groups like Project Censored validate the importance of real news. I'm a father of 2 young children. If we don't take action now, what kind of planet are we leaving for future generations?
I am a husband and father of 3 children, and their future is what is important to me. I have witnessed the hypnotic trance that the American people are under. Through this film, I hope to awaken society. News is a public service that has to be put back into the hands of the citizens.
Now I think I'm a kind of an average guy, not always up to date, but I like to try. I don't read much cause I'm on the go, so 6 or 11 I watch the show to see what's happening on the planet. Now I think there's a war in Iran or Iraq, I'm not sure which, they didn't talk about that. They showed 30 seconds of a high-speed chase from a helicopter view that kept the pace, and 1 hot minute on a dip in the market and a new kind of car and how to park it. All about cancer and how to prevent it, how $1 worth less and how we spent it. They showed some pictures of the game I saw and a Doppler of the weather that was getting raw. And finally a story of high import about a Hollywood star likes to drink and snort. That's junk food. Junk food news. Talking about junk food. Junk food news. What am I missing? I bought a newspaper, thought I'd give it a listen. Settled myself on the bedroom floor and opened it up to page number 4. And there was a story with a little more belt about the warming of the globe and the ice cap melt and the carbon in the air and the parts per million and all of the emissions and the future of the children. Facts and the graphs left little doubt. I said, man, that's what I'm talking about. That's some news with a little protein. A little while later in the middle of the night, I woke up feeling something wasn't quite right. Like when I thought the price was the best, till I saw it down the street, $5 less. I tried to figure out what was bugging me, and a little while later I began to see if the planet got to be in such a state, it must have started out at a gradual rate. And all them cats with their PhDs can send a dude to the moon and back again in the breeze. They must have known a long time ago. So why is this news is what I want to know? I'm getting angry and confused. Ran downstairs and I opened the sheet to the page with the story about the global heat. I looked at the bottom and as plain as the day it was an advertising message from Consolidated Ed. And all of a sudden I saw in a rage why Lindsay Lohan makes the frontal page. That's junk food. Junk food news. I said junk